This is my true story. I raised 9 sons alone after my wife died when the youngest was only 2 years old. I worked 3 jobs and sacrificed everything so they could have good lives and become successful. All 9 of them became doctors and lawyers and businessmen living in big houses. But as I got older, not one of them visited me and left me alone to rot with loneliness. I spent years alone, eating frozen dinners and going to cancer treatments by myself. But after so much struggle, I finally decided to end it, and you won't believe what I did next. Before I tell you, tell me where you are watching from, and please subscribe me so more people can hear my story. I lost my wife when my youngest son was only 2 years old, and my oldest was 16. She died suddenly from a heart condition nobody knew she had. One morning she was making breakfast and laughing with the boys, and by that afternoon she was gone. I was left alone with 9 children ranging from toddler to teenager, and no idea how I was going to raise them all by myself. My wife had been the heart of our family, and without her, I felt completely lost and broken. But I had 9 boys depending on me, and I could not fall apart. I had to be strong for them, even though I was dying inside from grief. I had to keep working and providing and making sure they had everything they needed. I could not afford to stop and mourn, because if I stopped, our family would collapse. So I pushed my grief down deep, and I focused on survival and taking care of my sons. I worked 3 jobs simultaneously to support 9 growing boys. I worked the day shift at a factory assembling parts for 8 hours. Then I would go straight to construction sites on weekends doing manual labor. At night, I worked as a security guard at an office building from midnight until 6 in the morning. I would come home and sleep for maybe 4 hours, and then start the cycle again. My body was constantly exhausted, and my mind was foggy from lack of sleep, but I kept going because my sons needed me. I slept 4 hours a night on average for years. Sometimes less if one of the boys was sick or needed help with homework or had a problem at school. I would drag myself out of bed after a few hours of rest and go back to work. My back ached constantly and my joints hurt, and I had headaches that never went away. But I ignored all of it because there was no time to rest and no money to see doctors. I just kept working and pushing through the pain. I did this so my sons could have food and clothes and education. I made sure there was always dinner on the table, even if it was simple. I made sure they had clean clothes to wear to school, even if I had to wash them by hand late at night. I made sure they could participate in sports and activities, even if it meant I had to work extra hours to pay the fees. I wanted them to have normal childhoods despite losing their mother. I sacrificed every dream I had ever had for myself. I had wanted to go back to school and get a better education. I had wanted to travel and see places beyond our small town. I had wanted to have hobbies and interests outside of work. But all of that got pushed aside because every minute of my time and every dollar I earned went toward my sons. They became my entire life and my only purpose. I sacrificed every comfort I might have enjoyed. I wore the same clothes until they had holes. I never bought anything for myself that was not absolutely necessary. I lived in the same small house, even though it was cramped with 9 boys sharing bedrooms. I never went out to eat or saw movies or did anything that cost money. Every penny was saved for my sons and their future. I sacrificed every moment of rest I might have had. Even when I was not working, I was cooking or cleaning or helping with homework or driving boys to activities. There was no downtime and no breaks. I was always doing something for someone else. My entire existence revolved around taking care of my 9 sons and making sure they had opportunities I never had. I gave them futures I never had for myself. I made sure they all finished high school. I worked extra jobs to help pay for college for the ones who wanted to go. I supported their dreams and their ambitions, even when it cost me everything. I wanted them to have better lives than mine. I wanted them to be successful and happy and not have to struggle the way I struggled. And they did become successful. All 9 of them grew up to have good careers and comfortable lives. But they forgot about the man who made it all possible. I watched all 9 of my sons grow into successful men with impressive careers and comfortable lives. 3 of them became doctors, specializing in different fields. 2 became lawyers, working at prestigious firms in big cities. The others became businessmen and engineers and professionals making good money. They lived in mansions and drove expensive cars and took vacations to places I had only seen in magazines. I was so proud of what they had accomplished, and I felt like all my sacrifices had been worth it. But as my hair turned gray and my body grew weaker from years of hard labor, their attention toward me faded away. When they first started their careers and were still young, they would call regularly and visit on holidays. But as they became more successful and their lives got busier, the calls became less frequent. What started as weekly calls turned into monthly calls. Then the monthly calls turned into calls every few months. Then the calls stopped almost completely, except for occasional text messages. Their visits became rare and then non-existent. They used to come home for Christmas and Thanksgiving, and we would all gather around the table like we did when they were children. But one by one they started making excuses about why they could not come. They said they were too busy with work. They said they had plans with their wives' families. They said travel was too expensive or too complicated. Eventually, they stopped coming at all, and I spent holidays alone in the house where I had raised them. My birthdays passed unremembered by the sons I had given everything for. I would wake up on my birthday, hoping for a call or a card, or some acknowledgement that they remembered. But the phone would not ring, and no cards would arrive in the mail. I would spend the day alone thinking about all the birthdays I had celebrated for them. All the cakes I had baked and the presents I had saved up to buy. All the parties I had thrown even when money was tight. And now they could not even remember the day I was born. I spent holidays completely alone in an empty house that used to be full of noise and laughter. Christmas was the worst. I would sit in my living room looking at old photos of my sons when they were young. I would remember how excited they used to get about Christmas morning. How they would run downstairs to see what presents were under the tree. Now the tree sat undecorated in the corner because there was no point in decorating it for just myself. I would eat a frozen dinner and go to bed early, trying not to think about how my 9 sons were celebrating with their own families without inviting me. My health started declining, and I had nobody to help me. I developed high blood pressure and diabetes and arthritis from years of hard physical labor. I had trouble walking and doing basic tasks around the house. I needed help, but I had nobody to call. My sons were too busy with their important lives to check on their elderly father who was struggling to take care of himself. Meanwhile, they posted photos on social media showing their perfect families and their beautiful homes and their expensive vacations. I would look at these photos on the computer and see them smiling with their wives and children. I would see them at holiday gatherings with extended family. But I was never in those photos. They had erased me from their lives completely. Their children, my grandchildren, did not know me because my sons never brought them to visit. I was a stranger to my own grandchildren. I sent them letters and emails updating them on my life and telling them about my health problems and my loneliness. I told them I missed them and wanted to see them. I asked if they could visit or at least call more often. Most of my letters went unanswered. A few of them would send short text message responses saying they were busy, but would try to visit soon. But soon never came. The promises were empty words meant to make me stop asking. I had 9 sons, and not one of them could spare a weekend to visit the man who had worked himself into the ground to give them everything. Not one of them cared enough to check if I was okay, or if I needed help, or if I was lonely. I fell twice in my kitchen and had nobody to call for help. The first time I slipped on a wet spot on the floor and landed hard on my hip. I lay there for almost an hour in pain before I could pull myself up using the counter. The second time I lost my balance reaching for something in a high cabinet and fell backward, hitting my head on the tile. I lay there dazed and scared, wondering if this was how I would die alone on my kitchen floor. I eventually managed to get up, but the falls made me realize how vulnerable I was living by myself with no family checking on me. I ate frozen dinners alone at a table that once held 10 people. Every night, I would heat up a sad little meal in the microwave and sit down at the big dining table by myself. I would look at all the empty chairs and remember when my wife was alive and all 9 boys were home. The table used to be loud and chaotic with everyone talking over each other and laughing. Now it was silent except for the sound of me chewing and the hum of the refrigerator. The loneliness was crushing. I spoke to photographs because the phone never rang. I had pictures of my sons and my late wife displayed around the house. I would talk to them like they could hear me. I would tell them about my day and ask them questions and pretend they were responding. I knew it was pathetic, but it was the only way I could cope with the silence. Sometimes I would go days without speaking to another living person. The mailman and the grocery store clerk were the only human interaction I had. I sent letters to my sons, updating them on my life and my health and my loneliness. I wrote long, detailed letters telling them about my doctor appointments and the medications I was taking and the pain I was dealing with. I told them how much I missed them and how I wished they would visit. I told them I was getting older and I did not know how much time I had left, and I wanted to see them before it was too late. I poured my heart into these letters, hoping they would finally understand how much I needed them. Most of my letters received no response at all. They disappeared into the void, and I never heard anything back. A few of my sons would send generic text message responses that felt like they were written by robots. They would say things like, "Sorry, you are not feeling well," or "Hope things get better soon," or "We will try to visit when we can." The messages were cold and impersonal, with no real emotion or concern behind them. They were just words meant to make me stop bothering them. The silence from my sons was deafening and soul-crushing. Every day I would check my phone hoping for a missed call or a voicemail. Every day I would check the mailbox hoping for a letter or a card. But there was nothing. My sons had moved on with their lives and left me behind like I no longer mattered. The man who had sacrificed everything for them was now just an inconvenience they wanted to forget about. I had 9 sons, and not one of them could spare a weekend to visit me. Not one of them could take a few days off from their important jobs to check on their elderly father. Not one of them cared that I was alone and struggling and in pain. They had their own families now and their own priorities, and I was not one of them. I had been useful when they needed someone to feed them and clothe them and pay for their education. But now that they were successful, they had no use for me anymore. I spent my final years in complete isolation. I woke up alone and went to bed alone. I spent holidays alone and birthdays alone. I dealt with health problems alone and fear alone. The house that had once been full of life and love was now empty and cold. I was surrounded by memories of my sons, but the actual sons were nowhere to be found. They had abandoned me completely and left me to suffer alone. When the cancer diagnosis came, I called each of my 9 sons personally to tell them. My hands were trembling as I dialed their numbers because I was terrified and I needed my family. The doctor had just told me I had stage 3 colon cancer and that I would need surgery and chemotherapy. I was 78 years old and facing the fight of my life, and I did not want to face it alone. I thought surely this news would make my sons realize how serious things were, and they would come to support me. I called the first son and got his voicemail. I left a message saying I had been diagnosed with cancer and I needed to talk to him. He called back 3 days later and said he was sorry to hear about the diagnosis. He asked a few basic questions about the treatment plan and then said he had to go, but he would try to visit soon. He never visited. I called the second son and he answered, but said he was in the middle of something important at work. I told him about the cancer, and he said that was terrible, and he would call me back later to talk more. He never called back. I went through this same experience with all 9 sons. Some did not answer and never returned my calls. Some answered but were clearly distracted and in a hurry to get off the phone. A few expressed sympathy, but it felt shallow and rehearsed, like they were reading from a script. All of them promised to visit soon, but none of them actually came. I had just told them their father had cancer, and they could not be bothered to make the trip to see me. I went through chemotherapy completely alone. Every week I would drive myself to the hospital and sit in the treatment room for hours while poison dripped into my veins. I would watch other patients who had family members sitting with them, holding their hands and keeping them company. I sat alone reading magazines and trying not to cry. The nurses felt sorry for me, and they would stop by to chat when they had time. They could see I had nobody, and they tried to make me feel less alone. I drove myself to appointments, even on days when I felt so sick I could barely stand. The chemotherapy made me nauseous and weak and dizzy. Some days I would vomit before leaving the house, but I still had to drive myself because there was nobody else to take me. I would grip the steering wheel with shaking hands and pray I would make it to the hospital safely. I would sit in waiting rooms alone while other patients had their children or spouses with them. I held my own hand through the fear and the pain and the uncertainty. At night, I would lie in bed feeling sick from the treatment and scared about whether I would survive. I would reach over to the empty side of the bed where my wife used to sleep, and I would hold my own hand, trying to comfort myself. I would cry alone in the dark, wondering how my life had come to this. I had 9 sons, and not one of them cared enough to be there for me during the hardest time of my life. My sons sent cards to acknowledge my illness. They were impersonal store-bought cards with generic messages about getting well soon. The cards had pre-printed words, and they just signed their names at the bottom. There were no personal messages or expressions of real concern. It felt like they had grabbed the cards from a drugstore shelf on their way to something more important. They thought a $5 Hallmark card could replace their presence and their support. A card cannot hold your hand during chemotherapy. A card cannot drive you to appointments when you are too weak to drive yourself. A card cannot sit with you in the hospital and distract you from the fear. A card cannot hug you when you are crying and scared. But my sons seemed to think sending cards was enough. They seemed to think they had fulfilled their duty as sons by mailing a piece of cardstock with someone else's words printed on it. I survived the cancer treatment through sheer determination and stubbornness. The doctors said it was a miracle that someone my age had made it through such aggressive chemotherapy without complications. But I knew the real reason I survived was because I had unfinished business. I had something I needed to do before I left this world. I needed to make sure my sons understood that their abandonment had consequences. So I fought through the sickness and the pain, and I beat the cancer that should have killed me. After my treatment ended and I was declared in remission, I spent months rewriting my will with cold clarity and absolute certainty about what I wanted to do. I sat across from my lawyer in his office, and I told him I wanted to make major changes to how my estate would be distributed. He looked surprised because my previous will had left everything divided equally among my 9 sons. But after years of being abandoned and ignored while I struggled with cancer alone, I had come to a decision that felt completely right and justified. My lawyer asked if I was sure about the changes and whether I wanted to take more time to think about it. He said cutting children out of a will was a serious decision that could not be easily undone. I told him I had been thinking about it for months, and I was absolutely certain. I said my sons had cut me out of their lives years ago, and now I was simply returning the favor in the only way I could. He nodded and started taking notes on everything I wanted to change. I had accumulated $12 million over my lifetime through careful savings and smart investments. Even while working 3 jobs to support my sons, I had managed to save small amounts of money whenever possible. I invested in stocks and mutual funds and watched them grow over decades. I lived frugally and never spent money on myself, so the savings kept accumulating. When my wife's family land was sold after her parents died, I received a portion of the proceeds, and I invested that money wisely as well. The money had grown substantially over the years, especially during my retirement when I was no longer supporting 9 children. I lived on very little and let my investments compound. I had planned to leave this money to my sons so they could have financial security and pass wealth on to their own children. I had imagined the money would help my grandchildren go to college or buy homes or start businesses. I had wanted to leave a legacy that would benefit my family for generations. But my sons had shown me they did not deserve that legacy. They had proven they did not care about me beyond what I could provide for them financially. They had taken everything I gave them when they were young and then discarded me when I was old and sick and lonely. They had abandoned the man who sacrificed everything for their success. Why should I reward that kind of cruelty with millions of dollars? Everyone who knew about my estate assumed the money would be divided equally among my 9 sons. People would ask me sometimes about my plans for the money, and I would give vague answers without revealing what I had decided. My sons certainly assumed they would each inherit over $1 million when I died. That assumption was probably the only reason any of them maintained even minimal contact with me. They were waiting for me to die so they could collect their inheritance. I could imagine them calculating in their heads what they would do with their share. They probably had plans for how they would spend the money or invest it. They probably looked forward to the day when their father would finally die and release the wealth he had been hoarding. They saw me as an obstacle between them and money they felt entitled to. They had no idea I was planning to take that money and give it away to people who actually deserved it. My lawyer prepared the new will according to my exact specifications. He made sure the language was clear and legally binding. He made sure there would be no loopholes my sons could exploit to challenge the will. He had the document witnessed and notarized properly. He told me the will was ironclad and my sons would have almost no chance of overturning it in court. After my will was finalized, I decided I wanted to see my sons' faces when they learned what I had done. I did not want to wait until after I was dead to get my justice. I wanted to be there to witness their reaction when they discovered they would inherit nothing. So I called each of my 9 sons and told them I needed them to come home for an important family meeting. I said it was urgent and involved my estate planning and their future inheritance. Suddenly, after years of being too busy to visit, they all cleared their schedules immediately. All 9 sons made travel arrangements and showed up at my house on the designated Saturday. It was the first time in over a decade that all of them had been in the same room together. It was the first time in years that any of them had visited me at all. They arrived in their expensive cars wearing their designer clothes. They greeted each other with hugs and small talk. They barely acknowledged me beyond brief, uncomfortable hellos. They were there for the money, not for their father. I had arranged for my lawyer to be present at the meeting. He arrived with his briefcase full of documents and sat up at the dining table. My sons gathered around looking eager and impatient. They thought this was going to be a routine discussion about estate planning. They thought I was going to explain how my assets would be divided and maybe give them some details about trusts or tax planning. They had no idea what was actually about to happen. The lawyer started by explaining that I had recently updated my will and wanted to inform my family of the changes. My sons nodded and leaned forward slightly, showing interest. This was what they had come for. This was the information they actually cared about. The lawyer said my estate was valued at approximately $12 million. My sons' eyes lit up at hearing the exact number. They started doing mental math, calculating their individual shares. The lawyer continued speaking in his professional tone. He said the previous will had divided the estate equally among all 9 sons, with each receiving approximately $1.3 million. My sons nodded like this was what they expected and deserved. Then the lawyer said, however, the will has been completely rewritten and the distribution has changed significantly. The room went quiet as my sons waited to hear how the money would now be divided. The lawyer opened his briefcase and pulled out copies of the new will. He distributed them around the table so each son had their own copy. He told them to turn to page 7, where the asset distribution was detailed. I watched their faces as they found the page and started reading. I watched the confusion appear first as they tried to make sense of what they were seeing. Then I watched the shock and horror as they realized what I had done. One of my sons looked up from the document and said there must be some mistake. He said his name was not listed anywhere in the distribution section. The lawyer said there was no mistake. Another son said none of their names were listed. The lawyer confirmed that was correct. A third son asked where the $12 million was going, if not to them. The lawyer told them to keep reading. My sons read the section that explained my entire estate would be donated to charitable organizations supporting abandoned elderly parents. The money would fund visiting programs and meal services and companionship initiatives for seniors whose children had forgotten them. Every dollar of the $12 million would go to help people like me who had been left alone by their families. The room erupted in shocked voices talking over each other. My sons demanded to know what was happening and why I was doing this. They looked at me with faces full of confusion and anger and panic. I sat quietly in my chair at the head of the table, and I looked at each of them calmly. Then I spoke for the first time since the meeting started. I looked at my 9 sons sitting around the table, and I said, "You are all wondering why I have removed you from my will. You are confused because you thought the money was yours by right of being my children. You thought you were entitled to inherit everything I worked for. But let me tell you exactly why you will receive nothing." My voice was calm and steady. I had practiced this moment in my mind for months, and now that it was here I felt completely in control. I said for years I have watched you abandon me while you lived your successful, comfortable lives. I said you stopped calling and stopped visiting and stopped caring whether I was alive or dead. I said I spent birthdays alone and holidays alone and went through cancer treatment alone because not one of you could be bothered to check on me. I said you sent me cards and text messages like that was adequate care for the man who raised you alone after your mother died. I reminded them that I worked 3 jobs to support them when they were children. I reminded them I slept 4 hours a night for years so they could have food and clothes and education. I reminded them I sacrificed every dream and every comfort so they could go to college debt-free and start their adult lives with opportunities I never had. I said, I gave you everything and you repaid me with abandonment and neglect. One of my sons tried to interrupt and say they had been busy with their careers and families. I held up my hand and said, I am not finished talking. I said busy is an excuse, not a reason. I said everyone is busy, but people who actually care about their parents find time to visit. I said other patients at the chemotherapy center had children who sat with them during treatment. I said other elderly people had families who called to check on them. I said being busy was not an excuse for years of complete abandonment. I told them about the times I fell in my kitchen and lay on the floor alone for hours. I told them about eating frozen dinners by myself at a table that used to seat 10. I told them about talking to photographs because the phone never rang. I told them about driving myself to cancer appointments when I was so sick I could barely see straight. I told them about every lonely birthday and every silent holiday and every moment I had needed them and they were not there. I said you assumed I would leave you my money because that is what parents do. You assumed I would reward your neglect with millions of dollars. You assumed blood relationship was enough to guarantee an inheritance regardless of how you treated me. But you were wrong about all of it. I said I survived cancer when I should have died because I wanted to live long enough to see your faces when you learned you would get nothing. My sons started talking over each other, trying to defend themselves and make excuses. They said they were sorry and they had not realized how bad things were. They said they would do better and visit more often. They said they would make it up to me if I would just reconsider the will. But I knew their promises were worthless. They were not sorry for abandoning me. They were sorry they were losing $12 million. I said the decision is final and the will is legally binding. I said I have taken every precaution to make sure you cannot challenge it in court. I said you will receive nothing from my estate when I die. I said instead, the money will go to organizations that help elderly people whose children abandoned them, just like you abandoned me. I said my legacy will be helping people who suffered what I suffered because of ungrateful children. The room fell into stunned silence. My sons stared at me like they could not believe what they were hearing. Some of them looked angry. Some looked devastated. Some looked like they wanted to argue but did not know what to say. I let the silence stretch out while they absorbed the reality that their inheritance was gone and there was nothing they could do about it. The lawyer cleared his throat and continued explaining the details of the will. He said my entire estate, valued at $12 million, had been designated for charitable organizations with a specific mission. The money would fund programs supporting elderly parents who had been abandoned by their children. Every dollar would go toward visiting services and meal delivery programs and companionship hotlines for lonely seniors who had nobody else. My sons erupted in protests and objections. One of them said this was insane and I was making a huge mistake. Another said I was being vindictive and cruel. A third said no judge would let me give away $12 million to strangers while my own children got nothing. They talked over each other, getting louder and more desperate. They demanded I reconsider and think about what I was doing. They said I was destroying their futures and hurting my grandchildren. The lawyer raised his voice to be heard over the chaos. He said the will was ironclad and had been prepared with extensive legal precautions. He said medical evaluations confirmed I was of sound mind when I made the changes. He said there was detailed documentation of the reasons for disinheritance, including records of missed visits and ignored phone calls and holidays spent alone. He said any attempt to challenge the will in court would fail and cost them a fortune in legal fees. One of my sons stood up and said he refused to accept this. He said I was his father and I owed him an inheritance. He said he had counted on that money for his retirement and his children's education. I looked at him and said, "You counted on money you never earned from a father you never visited." I said you felt entitled to wealth built by a man you treated like garbage. I said your sense of entitlement is exactly why you deserve nothing. Another son tried a different approach. He said they would start visiting regularly and rebuild our relationship if I would just change the will back. He said they realized they had made mistakes and they wanted to make things right. I said you had years to rebuild our relationship, and you chose not to. I said you only care now because money is involved. I said your sudden interest in being a good son is transparent and pathetic. The lawyer explained which specific charities would receive the money. He listed organizations that sent volunteers to visit isolated elderly people in their homes. He listed meal delivery services for seniors who had nobody to cook for them or help them eat. He listed hotlines where lonely elderly people could call and talk to someone who cared. Every charity addressed a need I had experienced personally during my years of abandonment. I told my sons that my name would be on buildings and programs funded by the donation. I said thousands of forgotten elderly parents would benefit from the money I earned through decades of hard work. I said my legacy would be helping people whose children failed them, just like mine failed me. I said every time they drove past a building with my name on it, they would remember what they lost through their own cruelty and neglect. My sons sat in shocked silence as the full reality sank in. They had spent years assuming the money would eventually be theirs. They had counted on inheriting over $1 million each. They had made financial plans based on that assumption. And now, in one meeting, I had taken it all away and given it to complete strangers. They could not process what had happened or understand how their father could do this to them. I stood up from my chair and looked at each of them one final time. I said, "This meeting is over, and you can leave now." I said, "You came here hoping to hear about your inheritance, and now you have heard the truth." I said, "You will get nothing because you gave me nothing when I needed you most." I said, "You can go back to your busy, successful lives, and I will go back to being alone. The only difference is now you know there is no fortune waiting for you when I die." Before my sons could leave, I told the lawyer to distribute the personal letters I had written for each of them. The lawyer pulled out 9 sealed envelopes from his briefcase. Each envelope had one of my sons' names written on it in my handwriting. He handed each envelope to the corresponding son. My sons took the envelopes with shaking hands. They looked at me with confusion and fear. They knew whatever was inside would not be pleasant. I told them they could read the letters now or take them home. Most of them tore open the envelopes immediately because they needed to understand why this was happening. They pulled out the handwritten letters that I had spent hours writing. Each letter was personal and specific to that particular son. I had documented their individual failures and abandonments in detail. The letters detailed every birthday they had missed over the past 10 years. I had written down the exact dates and the fact that they had not called or sent cards or acknowledged the day in any way. I reminded them of specific birthdays when I had sat alone hoping the phone would ring. I reminded them of all the birthdays I had celebrated for them when they were children. I told them how it felt to realize my own sons could not remember or did not care about the day I was born. The letters listed every phone call they had ignored when I tried to reach out. I had kept records of dates I called and left voicemails that were never returned. I had counted the number of times I asked them to visit, and they made excuses. I had documented their promises to come soon that turned into months and years of absence. The evidence of their neglect was undeniable and laid out chronologically. I described in detail the times I had eaten dinner alone while they posted vacation photos on social media. I told them I had seen the pictures of them with their families at holiday gatherings and celebrations. I told them how it felt to see them smiling and happy with everyone except me. I told them I had stared at those photos, wondering why I was not worth including when I had given them everything. I wrote about going through cancer treatment alone while they were too busy to visit. I described driving myself to chemotherapy and sitting alone in the treatment room. I described the fear and the pain and the nausea and having nobody to hold my hand through it. I told them about the days I was so sick I could barely stand, but still had to take care of myself because they were not there. Each letter concluded with the same paragraph that I had carefully crafted. I wrote, "You had years to visit me, but you chose not to. You had countless opportunities to show you cared, but you chose to ignore me. I had 12 million reasons to include you in my will, but you gave me 9 reasons not to. You are those 9 reasons. Each one of you individually chose to abandon your father, and now you are experiencing the consequences of that choice." My sons sat reading their letters with tears streaming down their faces. Some of them were crying from genuine remorse as they realized the depth of pain they had caused. Others were crying from anger and frustration at losing money they felt entitled to. A few were crying from shame as they read specific examples of their cruelty and neglect written in their father's handwriting. One son crumpled up his letter and threw it on the table in rage. Another sat staring at his letter in silence, unable to speak. Another tried to argue that the letter was not fair and that I had exaggerated things. But the lawyer said the letters matched the documentation I had provided, and everything in them was accurate and verifiable. The letters destroyed any remaining illusions my sons had about their relationship with me. They could no longer pretend they had been good sons who were just busy. They could no longer make excuses about demanding careers and family obligations. The letters forced them to confront the truth that they had abandoned their father when he needed them most, and now they were paying the price while I was still alive to see it. My 9 sons left my house that day in complete shock and devastation. They got into their expensive cars and drove away, knowing they had lost $12 million because of their own cruelty. Some of them tried calling me in the following days to beg for another chance. Some sent emails and letters promising they would change and be better sons. But I blocked their numbers and threw away their letters without reading them. I had given them years to be good sons, and they had wasted those years. I was done giving them chances. A few of my sons hired lawyers to see if they could challenge the will. Their lawyers reviewed the documents and told them they had virtually no chance of success. The will had been properly executed with witnesses and notarization. I had been evaluated by medical professionals who confirmed I was of sound mind. The documentation of their neglect was extensive and undeniable. Fighting this in court would cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars with no realistic hope of winning. 2 of my sons tried to challenge it anyway because they could not accept losing millions without a fight. They filed legal motions claiming I had been unduly influenced or that the charitable designations were invalid. Every challenge was rejected by the courts. The judges who reviewed the case found the will to be clear and legally sound. One judge commented that the sons had only themselves to blame and that I had every right to leave my money to whoever I chose. The legal battles cost my sons a fortune in attorney fees. They spent hundreds of thousands of dollars fighting over money they would never receive. Meanwhile, I was still alive watching them scramble and panic and blame each other. I took satisfaction in seeing them face consequences while I was still here to witness it. This was better than dying and leaving them to discover my decision after I was gone. This way, I got to see their faces and hear their desperation. The money I designated for charity is already starting to help people. I worked with the organizations while I was still alive to set up the programs exactly how I wanted them. Visiting programs were established to send volunteers to lonely elderly people. Meal delivery services were expanded to reach more isolated seniors. Companionship hotlines were created so people like me would have someone to call when they needed to talk. My name is now on buildings and programs that will exist long after I am gone. There is a community center for seniors with my name above the door. There is a visiting program named after me that sends volunteers to homebound elderly people. My sons drive past these buildings and see my name and know what they lost. They see the legacy I am leaving for strangers instead of for them. My sons tried to reconcile with each other after the will reading, but the relationships fell apart completely. They blamed each other for not visiting me more. They argued about who had been the worst son and who deserved the most blame. The family I worked so hard to hold together after my wife died has completely disintegrated. They barely speak to each other anymore, and several of them are not on speaking terms at all. I still live alone in my house, but now I have peace, knowing justice has been served. My sons learned too late that abandoning your parents has consequences. They learned you cannot ignore someone for years and then expect to inherit their wealth. They learned that being someone's child does not entitle you to their money if you treat them like garbage. I raised 9 sons alone after my wife died when the youngest was only 2 years old. I worked 3 jobs and slept 4 hours a night and sacrificed everything so they could succeed. And in my old age, when I was sick and lonely, not one of them visited me, so I removed all of them from my will and gave my $12 million to help abandoned elderly parents. They got exactly what they gave me, which was nothing at all. And I am still here alive and watching them suffer the consequences of their cruelty. Some lessons are best learned while the teacher is still alive to see the students fail.